Yes, so I'm going to show you and talk about like the basic idea of web development and like the main three components of web development. So this is the agenda, as I said before. So I'm going to do a brief introduction about myself, then some basic information about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are the main three building blocks. Wait, can I get this start popping up? Okay, I don't know. And then a demonstration of how they work together, as I said, and then a list of next steps for people that are interested in this topic to kind of, get some tutorials and start their own path through web development. My introduction. So yeah, some of the things Sarah already told you. My name is Maik Joosten. I was born in the Netherlands. Been living and working in Berlin since 2013. I've been developing websites since roughly around 2000. I kind of started when I was 14 as a hobby. And I've worked for clients like BMW, GLS, Lufthansa, and McDonald's. And yeah, I'm here to give you a basic understanding of what web development is and can do. HTML, the building blocks of everything. So as it says, structure and content. So HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language. It was first released in 1993, which is a long time ago. And it's used to define the structure and the content of a website. So on the right side in the image, you can see like an example that I'm going to come back to later in my live demo of what it looks like. So this is like the main structure and content code of every website. So as you can see, like the list and first item, second item, last item, this is content. And then the stuff that's in the angular brackets are the HTML tags that basically tell your browser what kind of information this is. I'm going to show you some example tags here, which we'll come back to later in the live example. So you have headings, which is the H1 through H6 tag. So the bigger the number after the H, the smaller by default the font sizes are. So pretty much every HTML tag has a default styling, which is more or less consistent among all the internet browsers that exist currently. It used to be a lot more diverse, but luckily they kind of agree for the most part now. So everything looks roughly the same on every browser if you don't explicitly style it with CSS, which we'll come to later. Then we have a paragraph tag, which is generally used for text blocks. Then we have lists, which come in two different sorts, ordered list and unordered list. The main difference of that is by default, the ordered list shows you the number, so 1, 2, 3, 4 for all the items, and the unordered list just shows like the bullets, so the dots. One quick pause, sorry, Sarah. I see like some people holding up their hands and stuff. I don't know should I stop for that, or is that something you guys are looking at?
I am looking at that, and as questions arise that I think you need to address, I will let you know.
Okay, thank you. No, I just wanted to make sure we don't lose anything. Okay, so those are the lists, as I said, and each list has list items, which is the li tag, which you can see there in the middle. Yes, again, we will come back to this later in more detail. Then for forms, so form fields like inputs and drop downs, they have labels. So this is the field that needs a name, this field needs an email, etc. Then we have the actual input, which is called input very practically. Then drop down lists, which are called select, and they have multiple option tags, which hold all the options that you can select from. So this is like the multiple choice stuff. And buttons are buttons. So like you see, a lot of these things are very logically named. Some are maybe a bit more abstract, like the P and the OL, because otherwise it might get too long. But overall, like once you kind of know what is what, it's all very logical. Then let's continue on with CSS, which is one of my favorite parts of this whole thing, styling and animation. So as I said, by default, everything has like its basic style that the browsers kind of set for you. But I don't think there's a lot of websites out there nowadays that use much of any of the basic styles, because every website kind of has their own styling, of course, and own branding. And that's where CSS comes in. Excuse me. So CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheets. Was first released in 1996, so also pretty old. used for styling and animating of HTML elements, which I'll come to later. And one of my favorite things about CSS, and this is just going back in the way back machine when I first started off, when CSS was kind of still up and coming. In the first versions, you basically had to style every element on the spot. So you would have to say like, this thing is font size 20 and that thing is color blue and whatnot, which was not terrible. But if you had like a bigger website with a lot of pages and you wanted to change all the headings like to like a different color, for instance, you had to do this manually for every page, which again, if you have a bigger website, was really a lot of work. So with style sheets, you pretty much are able to abstract the styling to a separate file. So instead of telling the H1 that its color is blue, you can have a separate file saying, okay, of all the H1s, the color has to be blue. And then you can just use the same file for all the pages. And then if you end up changing the color from blue to red, you only have to do it in one spot. So that's a huge time saver. If you have a very big, even if you have a small website, I guess, but especially if you have bigger websites. And here you can see like a rough idea of how CSS is structured. So this top, and I don't know, you can see, I have no cursor. So the button, which is orangey in top, is the selector, as it's called. So this is basically telling CSS, like, this is the element, the HTML element that I want to target with this. So in this case, I want to change the button color. Then you have these curly brackets, which is pretty much just to group all the information that belongs to this button. So if I had a second CSS style that comes next after this one, then it would have a different selector and it would have its own bracket. So it's very clear where this one stops. Then all the white text on the left side, at least, like background, border, color, font size, height, and padding, are called properties. So pretty much this is telling the browser, these are the things I want to change on this button. So in my case here, I want to change the background, I want to change the border, because by default there's a border on the button, etc. And then the ones after the colon and before the semicolon are called the values. So this is where I say I want the background of this button to be tomato colored. I don't know why tomato is like one of the standard colors I picked. And I want the color of the text to be white, because by default it's black. I want to change the font size to 18 pixels, etc. Again, I'll come back to this a bit later in the live demo. And then another one of my favorites, which has really, really increased in size and scope in the last, I would say, 10 years maybe, which is JavaScript, which used to be just like a little extra thing that you could do a few things with. But nowadays, I would say the vast majority of websites are like, I don't know percentages, but like the most of every website is run by JavaScript at this point. Like, it's taking over HTML to some extent, it's taking over CSS to some extent. It's really becoming like the main language for websites nowadays. And yeah, like it says, JavaScript is responsible for the functionality. So you can change how things interact and how the user interacts with your website using JavaScript. It was first released in 1995, and as I said, it's used for the logic and interaction of a website. Yes, why did it? No, I didn't change the image. Excuse me. So on the right, you see an example, which is also part of the live demo later. You can see like the different parts. So at the start, it's called a comment. So the one that starts with the 2 slashes. So this is very useful, especially if you have like bigger projects and there's a lot of lines of code, and generally speaking your code should be readable enough that everybody that hasn't seen it before can look at it and knows what it does. But sometimes things get very specific, and then it's always good to add a comment so other people, and even maybe you, after like a few months of coming back to your own code, can kind of figure out like what is this bit supposed to do. And that's where comments come in. So you can basically type stuff after these slashes, and then it's pretty much ignored by the browser. So it's just for the people looking at the code to have some context of what's going on without the program, like the browser, freaking out. And it's like, what is this? I don't know these commands. Then the line afterwards start with var, which is short for variable, which is where you can declare variables. So in this case, I'm making a function which is called check form, which, as you can probably guess, checks the form that we'll come to later. And then the if statement that comes after that is called a condition. So you can basically, with JavaScript, check like if a certain condition is met, then I want you to do a certain thing. And if it's not met, then you can do something else. So in this case, I'm checking if the name field has a value. Don't worry about the details with the triple equal signs. That's a bit more advanced. So pretty much I'm checking like if it doesn't have a value. So if the value is an empty string in this case, so like is the empty, if the value is empty, let's say, then show an alert saying like, please enter your name. So the user can tell like, okay, I'm trying to submit this form, but for some reason it's telling me I need to fill in my name first before I can do that. And then if it passes, if it doesn't pass the check, so if it's not an empty name, then it goes into the else statement, which in this case changes the label on the button to done. And then the bit at the end basically says like, for this button, if I click on it, I want to run the function check form. Again, I'll come back to this in a bit more detail afterwards. Yes, demonstration. So I don't know, Sarah, is there anything I can answer at this point maybe before I go in, or should I just continue?
There are no questions that I see, but if people want an opportunity to ask a question, feel free. Go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat box. Right, I see 3 hands. Maybe I go ahead and okay, doesn't seem like there's any questions, so we'll continue on.
Okay, cool. Then I'll show you the demonstration which I prepared, which I have to go out of this one real quick and go into this one. Can you all see this? Hopefully. I always have to double check with full screen stuff. Sarah?
Yes, sorry, say that one more time.
Yeah, can you see the other screen, like the web development basics with the...
I see heading
okay,
list.
No. Okay, no, cool. I was just making sure, like I said, like
yep.
Zoom and full screen stuff, sometimes it doesn't work. Okay, so let me show you this. So pretty much this is some of the parts I displayed in the presentation before came from this example code. Wait, let me close this up real quick. So this at the top here, you can see this is the HTML code, and at the bottom you can see the result of how the browser shows this code. So like the end result of this code pretty much. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. So as you can see, it starts with HTML tags, which pretty much tells the browser what kind of language this file is using. So the browser knows how to interpret it. Then every HTML page has 2 main parts, the head and the body. So the head at this point doesn't do much. It just has a title tag, which is like the name you see in your browser at the top or in the tabs of the browser. There's some other information that often goes into the head, like metadata, for instance, for like search engines and other important stuff, sometimes like external images and stuff that need to be imported. So pretty much in the head, it's like a lot of stuff that's not displayed directly, but it's needed for, for other functionality of the website. And then the body, as you might guess, has the actual content in it. So in this case, you can see here, I have an H1 tag, which is a heading, which then is displayed as this heading down here, which these are all the default styles, by the way. I'll come to the CSS after. And you can see I have 2 paragraphs here. So you open the tag with the angular brackets, then it has the text here. And at the end of the paragraph, I have another the closing tag for the paragraph text, which has a slash before the P. So this basically tells the browser like this is where it starts with the bracket P bracket, and then with the bracket /P bracket, it closes this block. So this is one HTML element pretty much, and the same with the heading. And then I have a second one here just to kind of show you that by default, you can see there's like a space between the 2 paragraphs, which is one of the default stylings of paragraph tags. Then if you go down a little bit, you can see an H2, which is smaller than the H1 by default, and then the 2 different types of lists that I mentioned. So we have the the ordered list, which has the 1, 2, 3, and then the unordered list, which has the bullets, which again, you can change with CSS if you wanted to. And then each of these lists has the LI list items. Then we have an H3, which is again smaller than the other two. And like I said, it goes down to H6. So the larger the number, the smaller they are by default. Oh yeah, also maybe good to know for those that are interested in this kind of stuff. For search engines, they generally look for these things. So because H1 is the biggest header by default, like the biggest text, search engines assume that the text that is in these is one of the more important texts on your website. So if you want to do search engine optimization kind of stuff, then it's best to use like H1 and H2 tags for these types of keywords, because that's what the search engines look for. Because like I said, with CSS, you can just change the styling of all of these. So technically, for styling purposes, you wouldn't need these H tags anymore. But because of functionality stuff, and also like for some, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking. This is basically like it's better to use the tags that are specifically used for these purposes for a lot of reasons. So it's better just to use the ones that are used for it and then just change the style as you want it to, basically. And then at the end, you can see I made a little dummy form. So you can see the label name, as you can see down here. And then we have an input, which has a type text. There's some other types you can have here, like checkboxes, for instance, which are displayed differently. And then we have a drop down here, which is this one, which you can see like the options that I put in, like the first one's empty, then we have dogs and we have cats. And then ignore this message for now, there's something for later for the JavaScript portion. And then we have a button which says submit, as you can see at the bottom here, which at this point doesn't do anything yet. So this is basically, as I said, this is like the HTML structure. So this is all the content and the layout to some extent. This is how it's structured, and at the bottom you can see what it looks like by default. And this is where things get interesting. Now I'm going to open up the CSS part here. Actually leave this open a little bit. And then I remove this comment, and then it enables the CSS, and then you can see it changed quite a bit. So as I said in the presentation, so this part is called the selectors. In this case, I'm targeting this H1 tag. And I'm telling the browser, like, I want to change the font family to monospace. So this is like generally also like the same font types that are used here, which like every letter has the same width. So yeah, so you can see like the M is the same width as the Z. So it always lines up really neatly, which is really useful for coding purposes. And I changed the font size to 50 pixels. So if I change this to 70 now, it takes a second and it makes it bigger. Then for the paragraph, I changed the color to cornflower blue, which is one of the default colors. You can also, you have more, you can do like RGB, like red, green, blue types of color mixing. But for this purpose, I figured I'd just stick with some of the default ones. And excuse me, I also changed the width on this one. So you can see like if I change this to 800, the paragraphs get wider. If I change this to 400 pixels, they get smaller. So this kind of stuff you can also use for layout purposes. So you can, exactly define how tall and how wide things are. Then the lists are as they are. I didn't change those for this example, but you can see the input has changed quite a bit. So I changed the border color to salmon, which you can see is like this nice reddish pink. Then I changed the font size of the input to 20. So you can see it's bigger than it is by default. I changed the height to 44 pixels. It's a lot higher. And I added a margin at the bottom so it doesn't hit the next. So I can show you if I remove this temporarily. See, then now the input and the next label are touching, which is visually not super nice to see. So generally, like, we try to add like a little bit of margin between separate things, so it's a bit more clear which belongs to which. So now it's more clear that this label belongs to this input and this label belongs to this dropdown. And then speaking of the dropdown, for this one, I changed the border color to yellow-green. I don't know, I just picked some random colors. Please excuse the weird color combinations. Also here, I changed the font size to 20, so it's bigger than it was by default. So if I remove this temporarily, you can see it's smaller. And yeah, same thing here. So I changed the height to 44, so it's consistent with this one, and the width as well, and then a margin so it doesn't touch the button directly. And then the button, I gave it, this is pretty much like the one from the, from the presentation. So you can see I changed the background color to tomato. I removed the standard border. You can see if I turn this back, it has a border again. I changed the text color to white because otherwise by default it's black and it's a bad contrast with the tomato background color. I changed the font size again. I changed the height of the button, which again, you can see by default it's a lot smaller. Might take a second. No, I changed it somewhere else, sorry. And I added some padding on the sides, which you can see, so it doesn't feel as squished. And then, so you can basically see, let me put this back again. So you can see the difference again, like how it looked before I put in the CSS. So you can see it's a pretty significant difference between the standard styles and my styles. Then I'm going to clear this out real quick. And then I'm going to go to the JavaScript part, which is it's fairly minimal because I didn't want to confuse you with too much information at once. So like I said, there's going to be like some links at the end where you can do some tutorials for yourself if you're interested, and they go a bit deeper into all of this. So as you can see, like I added the JavaScript now, which didn't change visually anything, but it did change some functionality. So this part, you can see the comment I added to find the necessary elements. So this function pretty much allows me to find things by the tag. So in this case, I want to find this input, which is the name field, and I give it a variable name of name field. So I know, it's a logical name for later. I do the same for the select, which is the drop-down field at the bottom. I call that pet choice. And then I get the button, and then this message thing that I'm going to use in this example, I'm also using. I'm also getting with this. Then this is the function that we showed. Might have changed a little bit from the example. So this is a function that's called update message. And what this function does, no, it was another function I showed in the example, excuse me. So what this function does is pretty much it checks the value of the name field and of the pet choice. And if both of these have a value, then I build a message. I'll show you that right now. So if I fill in my name here, and then I choose a dog here, then it says Mike likes dogs. So that's what this function currently does. So I added these two lines, which basically says when the dropdown changes value, then run this function. So it checks again if everything's filled in. And also if the name field on key up is pretty much like if you're typing, so that's the event that it triggers the function again. So you can see if I change this now while I'm typing, you see it updates it live. Oh, let me not misspell my own name. And if I change this to cats, it shows cats. And if I remove this, then it doesn't change it because it doesn't enter this part. Yeah, so that's what this part does. And then we have the function that was in the presentation before, which is check forms. So let me reset this again. So in this case, if I click the submit button right now without a name field, you can see at the top here, it shows me the alert saying, please enter your name. So that's the result of it checks. So if the name field value is empty, then give me an alert, please enter your name. If I put my name back in and then click on submit, it says done, because it checks, is it empty? It's not empty, then else. I change the button label to done. And then this is pretty much saying, like, if you click on the button, run this function to check. Yeah, so that's the real quick version of how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript kind of interact with each other. Like I said, this is linked to this one, will be in the slides. So you can have a look at this after the presentation kind of in more depth, and you can also play around with this editor yourself, so you can change some stuff here and kind of play with the colors if you want. I have one more example, which just to kind of show how much you can do with CSS. It's a bit of an extreme example, but I thought what maybe interesting to see how far you can take things. So this is like a default button without any extra styling. And when I click it, I add the CSS to it, and yeah, you kind of get. So I also added some animation so you can kind of see the changes step by step. So you can see I changed the background color of the page, I changed the color of the button, I changed the color of the button text. I removed the standard border, I added shadows and like highlights so it looks a bit more 3D. And if I click it again, you can see basically like the same steps in reverse. So all of this is, except, I mean, it's a little bit of JavaScript to trigger the button, but everything else is purely CSS. So all this button does is add the CSS or remove the CSS if you click it again. So you can kind of see, yeah, what a contrast it is between the CSS version or the non-CSS default version of this. Yeah, so that's the live demonstration, and let me go back to the last few slides because I don't know if we're good on time or not. So as I said, like this is the link to the live demo that I just did, so you can afterwards you can play with this and kind of test it for yourself. And this is the second last slide, where to start. So if you are interested in web development, and why wouldn't you be? It's lovely. So these are some steps and links to tutorials that I can totally recommend. So as I said, the basic of everything is HTML and CSS, because without HTML and CSS, there's not much you can do. So I would definitely start with HTML first, so you can get like a rough idea of how it's structured and which tags you can use for which purposes. And then second, after that would be learning CSS, so you can use the things you learned in the HTML tutorial to change the colors and sizes, and probably not animation in this stage, but you know, you can get a good idea of what CSS allows you to do. Once you have a bit of an idea of how HTML and CSS work, then I would suggest the introduction to JavaScript one. After that, I think the step between step 2 and 3 is probably a little bigger step. So I would, after that, suggest to look at CSS preprocessors, which is a fancy way of saying, yeah, what is that saying? Pretty much, back in the old days, we wrote CSS, which is the styles that the browser knows. But then someone was smart enough to use to create like a separate language, which is very heavily based on CSS, which allows you to do some extra stuff to really make your life easier. So the main example of that would be you can make variables like you would in JavaScript, but you can make that in CSS. And first, let's say if you have like 10 colors that you use, you know, 10 different colors that are part of your brand or your style of the website that you use for everything, like text and buttons and I don't know what background colors. It's really useful if you can put them in variables with a CSS preprocessor. So again, if you end up changing your main color from orange to blue, you don't have to go through the whole website and find everywhere where you set it to blue and change it to orange. You can just have one variable, one central point that says like the main color is this orange, and then you can say, okay, I want this main color to now be this blue, and then automatically updates it everywhere. There's also some other fancy things you can do with that, but I'm not going to get into that right now because that's a bit too advanced, I think, at this point. And once you've gotten the hang of all three of these, then I would have a look at JavaScript frameworks like React or Vue, which is probably what a good 80% of all websites at this point in time are made in. So again, these are kind of similar conceptually to this CSS preprocessor, where it's still JavaScript, but they just added a lot of things to make your life much simpler. Again, I'm not going to go into any details, and there's also really good tutorials about these, but both React and Vue, their own like websites have like documentation and like examples and guides and tutorials that you can go through to kind of figure out which one is your favorite. Because for me personally, I'm a big fan of Vue, but React at this point in time is still more used, I think. But I mean, they're not super different, but they have like some ways of doing things differently that I think it's just like a personal preference thing. So I would suggest trying, if you can only try one, probably try React, because that is the big one right now. But it's not as big a difference anymore as it was a few years ago. Vue is really catching up. So if you have the time and you get to this point, I would suggest trying both and kind of seeing which ones which one makes more sense for your way of working, I guess. And yeah, that was the end of my long talk.
Thank you.
Yes, so Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. We do have a series of questions that I did send to you directly in the chat.
Let me go
but
back
if you
to
prefer, I could also read them to you.
No, well, I couldn't see them on full screen, but let me see. Well, actually, if you could read them, maybe it's better, because I see a lot of chat and I don't know where I just start.
So the question is, what is the need of PHP Java in building a website?
Okay. So both PHP and Java actually is also kind of an example of pre-processing to some extent. So like I said, like the SCSS and LS are pre-processors for CSS. So they are like a language that helps you make CSS in a more easy and better and more flexible way. And Java has some other functionality, but purely from a website point of view, both PHP and Java are used as HTML preprocessors. So basically in PHP and Java, you can make, how do I say this? So both of these pretty much allow you to create HTML more easily. So if you have things that are repeated, for instance, if you have like a website which like has like a list of people, for instance, like About Us page, and that's like a list of team members, for instance. So instead of for each team member making this block with the image and the name and everything and the link to their own website or whatever, instead of doing this separately for each of the people, you just make a team member thing once and then push in variables for each team member. So instead of writing this whole block of HTML for each of them, you just write it once and then basically tell either PHP or Java, like this is a list of people that I have. For each of these people on the list, output this block of HTML. It's just like a very simple example of the things you can do with both of these. Also, I think both of these are very heavily used in backend usage, but that's not part of this, so I'm not going to go into that. Pretty much like most websites now, the content isn't part of the HTML directly. It generally comes from a CMS like a WordPress or something else. So like there's the division between the actual website and the content. So the content will be done in some kind of a system separately, where it's just the text and images, and then through this backend layer, they are sent to the front end, which is where the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript come in, and then pretty much they use this content to generate the HTML. I hope that was a good answer.